Okay, so picture this. Tractors are blockading Parliament, public services are stretched to their absolute limit, and a new national budget is causing these huge divisions all across the country. Over the past year, it's really felt like the UK has been a nation on edge. But what's the thread connecting all of it? Well, it all comes back to a handful of really hard economic choices that had massive, far reaching consequences. Disastrous human impacts. I mean, that's not a phrase you hear every day, especially not from the head of a major industry talking about a government budget. This quote from the National Farmers Union president just perfectly captures that raw, visceral reaction to a policy that sent shockwaves right through the UK's farming heartland. These were the scenes all over the news, right? Tractors just rolling through the streets of London, farmers literally at the gates of Parliament, key ports completely blocked. It was an incredible show of protest. So, what on earth drove them to it? Let's get into it. To really understand why the farmers were so angry, you have to look at the numbers. You have to go inside the economic engine room and see the really challenging financial situation the government was dealing with. This is where it all started. Here's the first huge number you need to know. £26 billion. That's the projected annual increase in the UK's tax burden by the end of the decade. That is a massive figure, and it was right at the heart of the government's entire strategy to get the nation's finances under control. So what does that 26 billion actually look like? Well, it means the tax to GDP ratio, that's the total tax collected as a slice of the entire economy, is set to hit 38%. That's a post-war high. It just gives you a sense of the sheer scale of the squeeze. And here's the other side of the coin. You might think, okay, more tax means less debt, right? Well, not so fast. The national debt is still projected to finish the decade at a staggering 96% of GDP. So even with those higher taxes, that mountain of debt is still enormous. So where are all these numbers coming from? It's really important to know they're not just pulled from some political press release. They come from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR. Think of them as the UK's independent, impartial fiscal watchdog. They're the official referee in all of this. So, how was this strategy actually put into practice? Well, a huge chunk of that new revenue came from extending the freeze on personal tax thresholds. It's a kind of stealth tax, really, because as wages rise with inflation, more and more people are quietly pulled into higher tax brackets. At the same time, welfare spending was set to go up, especially by removing the two-child limit in universal credit. And to make it all work, the government just had to accept higher debt in the short term. Okay, so we've looked at the abstract numbers and the government strategy. Now let's see how that played out in the very real, very muddy fields of British farming. This is where the economic plan first collided head-on with public anger. And this was the spark that lit the fuse. A very specific policy buried in the budget, a new inheritance tax on agricultural land. It almost immediately got nicknamed the tractor tax, and it's the reason farmers took to the streets. And this just highlights the massive disagreement between the two sides. On one hand, you have the government saying, look, this is targeted, it'll only affect about 500 farms a year. But on the other, you have the farming unions warning that it could eventually hit over 70,000. That's not a small gap in opinion, that's a chasm. And it was right at the heart of this whole conflict. And the reaction? It wasn't just a one-day story. This was a sustained campaign of disruption. It kicked off with thousands of farmers in London in November 2024, then escalated to those go-slow convoys blocking major ports, and we saw tractors back in the capital well into 2025. They were not backing down. But this fiscal pressure, it didn't just stop at the farm gate. It sent shockwaves through the UK's public services, revealing a system that was already under incredible strain from all sides, including a brutal winter flu-nami that was threatening to completely overwhelm the NHS. So, first, let's take a look at the asylum system, which was facing both a deep human crisis and a spiraling financial one. So what happened here is that policy cuts, like slashing the move-on period for refugees who had been granted asylum, had a direct and devastating human impact. We saw reports of a rising risk of homelessness. And at the same time, the financial side was just getting worse, with the OBR forecasting that asylum accommodation costs were going to balloon to over £15 billion over the next decade. Okay, next up is policing, which became a real-life example of what happens when ambitious plans for reform crash into the hard wall of financial reality. The data here is pretty stark. The median time it takes police to actually charge a suspect has nearly tripled in just under a decade, from 14 days up to 41. Think about what that means for victims waiting for justice. And while this is happening, a massive radical plan to shrink England's 43 police forces down to the mid-teens was being threatened by a lack of funding. Justice was slowing down right as major reforms were stalling out. And finally, a truly damning report on child sexual abuse forced a major U-turn from the government, and it triggered what can only be described as a national reckoning. You can just see the dominoes falling here. First, in June 2025, Baroness Casey's audit is published, and it reveals decades of shocking institutional failure. The public pressure becomes immense. And by December, the government completely reverses its previous position and announces a formal independent inquiry. This was a pivotal moment, a direct response to a crisis that just couldn't be ignored any longer. So, after a full year of fiscal fallout, protests, and all this political turmoil, where did that leave the UK? Well, the nation really did feel like it was hanging in the balance. And yet, even in the middle of all that strain, there were these incredible moments of pride and achievement. The artist Nena Kalu winning the prestigious Turner Prize. That was a landmark moment for learning disabled artists. It was just this brilliant, powerful story of inclusion and creativity shining right through a really difficult year. And that's where we're left. A year that was defined by incredibly hard choices that created these deep divisions that stretched from the fields of the countryside right to the halls of Westminster. The protests might have quieted down for now, and the new policies might be set, but the fundamental question is still hanging in the air. What kind of foundation has this turbulent year actually laid for the future of the UK?